Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad of your company on another quiet night. Tell me, is there a document before you this evening? Something official, something signed, and stamped and trusted without a second thought. Watson understood that a name on a page carries the full weight of our confidence, and that such confidence, carefully studied, may reveal far more than the words themselves. Do subscribe, so no margin goes unread. Now settle in, for as Holmes knew, what we accept without question is precisely where the truth conceals itself. Find us on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. The link is just below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman from Surrey. There are cases which arrive at Baker Street wearing the quiet dress of routine inquiry, yet conceal beneath that modest exterior a depth of villainy sufficient to disturb the most seasoned observer of human nature. It is of such a case that I now propose to write, one which tested Sherlock Holmes's powers as few others had done, and which left upon my own mind an impression I have never quite managed to dispel. The morning upon which the affair began was in late October, one of those raw, grey London mornings, when the fog presses close against the window-panes, and the fire in the sitting-room acquires an almost moral significance. Holmes had been in one of his introspective moods for the better part of a week, speaking little, eating less, and occupying himself with a series of chemical experiments whose purpose he declined to share. I had grown accustomed, in our years together, to these intervals of apparent idleness. They were seldom what they appeared. I was engaged with the morning papers when Mrs. Hudson knocked and announced that a gentleman wished to consult Mr. Holmes on a matter of some delicacy. Holmes, without looking up from the retort he was warming over a spirit lamp, gave the briefest of nods, and presently our visitor entered. He was a man of, perhaps, 55, well-made and carefully dressed in the manner of a provincial professional who takes pride in maintaining metropolitan standards. His coat was of good quality, his boots polished to a high shine, and his bearing was that of a man accustomed to commanding respect in rooms where other men were nervous, prows. Yet it was equally clear to any attentive eye that something had shaken him considerably. His hat, post, which he turned repeatedly in his hands as he stood in the doorway, was damp from the fog. The lines about his mouth had the particular set of a man who has spent several nights reconsidering a decision he has, finally, reluctantly made. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am Lionel Ainsworth, a solicitor with chambers in Guildford. I must beg your indulgence for arriving without appointment, but the matter will not wait. And I confess I do not entirely trust correspondence on a subject of this nature." Holmes had set down his experiment and was regarding the visitor with that expression of cool appraisal which could make the boldest man feel he being read like a page of print. "Pray sit down. Mr. Ainsworth," said he, "you have come up from Guildford on the first available morning train. You have had no breakfast, and you debated considerably before entering this building. I should hear what you have to say." Ainsworth blinked, settled himself into the armchair, and drew a slow breath. "You are correct on all points," said he, with the practised composure of a man who argues for a living. "I came on the early train. I have not eaten, and I have indeed debated this visit, because what I am about to describe involves persons of considerable standing, and I am keenly aware that, once I set events in motion, cannot call them back." I drew my own chair a little closer. There was something in the man's manner, a gravity held carefully in check, that told me this was no ordinary client with an ordinary grievance. "Ainsworth," then laid before us the substance of his concern. Some 10 days previous, a civil and criminal trial of some public interest had concluded at the Surrey Assizes. The defendant was one Sir Edwin Mallory, a wealthy industrialist whose various enterprises had made his name familiar to readers of the financial press. He had stood accused of fraud on a considerable scale. The systematic manipulation of accounts pertaining to a railway construction venture in which a number of smaller investors had lost their savings. The evidence, Ainsworth described it, and as the newspapers had rather breathlessly confirmed, had seemed to many observers conclusive. The Crown's presentation had been methodical, the witnesses credible, the documentation extensive. Public opinion had moved firmly against Sir Edwin before the jury retired. The acquittal, when it came, struck London like a cold draught through a badly fitted window. Whispers began almost immediately. There was talk in the clubs, in the law courts, in the offices of solicitors such as Ainsworth himself. The jury, it was murmured, had been reached. Some man of influence had ensured the verdict, yet no evidence of bribery presented itself. No juror had been observed in compromising company. No unexplained sums appeared in any traceable account. There is, however, one particular fact, said Ainsworth, leaning forward, which I have not seen reported in any newspaper, and which I believe to be the true heart of the matter. Shortly before the trial commenced, one of the selected jurors, a Mr. Thomas Vale of Croydon, was taken ill with a sudden inflammation of the lungs. His physician certified him unfit for service. A substitution was made, as the law permits. His place was taken by a quiet tradesman by the name of Caleb Wren. And Wren, said Holmes quietly, his fingertips pressed together. Vanished entirely, said Ainsworth. He cannot be located at the address given in the jury records. Neighbours in the street know the name, but describe a man who has not been seen since the day the verdict was returned. The records pertaining to his selection are, to a degree that I find frankly remarkable, incomplete. Holmes rose from his chair and began the slow circuit of the room which I associated with the ignition of his interest in a problem. Vanishing of a juror, said he, is inconvenient. The vanishing of the records pertaining to that juror is suggestive. What brings you specifically to Baker Street rather than to Scotland Yard or to the Director of Public Prosecutions? Ainsworth paused, and I thought I saw a flicker of something uncomfortably close to shame pass across his disciplined features. Because, said he carefully, I have reason to believe that the irregularity did not originate with Sir Edwin Mallory, or with any hired agent acting on his behalf. Records that have gone missing were not removed from any solicitor's office or from any private collection. They were official court documents, held within the courthouse itself, managed by officers of the court. If the jury roll was tampered with, Mr. Holmes, tampered with from inside the machinery of justice. There was a short silence. The fog pressed against the windows. Fire shifted in the grate. That, said Holmes, returning to his chair and lifting the surviving documents which Ainsworth had placed upon his table, is an entirely different species of crime. He studied the papers for some minutes without speaking. I watched his face, which rarely betrayed its workings, and saw his eyes pause at a particular point near the lower margin of the amended jury roll. You observe this correction, said he at last, turning the page toward me and indicating a line where a name had been neatly altered. The handwriting is careful, educated, and consistent throughout, with one small exception. Here, in the loop of this letter, again in the crossing of this character, the pen, Two different writers worked upon this document, or one writer, worked at two different times with something pressing upon his mind during the second occasion. Ainsworth stared. I had not noticed that. Few would, said Holmes, and set the document down with something that might, in a less restrained man, been eagerness. I must ask you to say nothing of having consulted me, not to colleagues, not to the police, and most particularly not to anyone connected with the Surrey courts. Watson, he added, turning to me with a brief decisive glance, I imagine you are free to travel tomorrow. I assured him that I was, and our visitor departed with rather more colour in his face than he had brought in with him. Holmes stood at the window, watching the street below, the jury papers held loosely at his side. An acquittal engineered within the administration of justice itself, said he, as much to the fog as to me. Not a crude bribe paid in a back room, but something woven quietly into the record. The most dangerous crimes, Watson, are those which wear the clothing of ordinary procedure. He said nothing more that evening, but I noticed that the chemical experiments were abandoned and that he sat for a very long time in his chair, with the jury documents spread across his knees, his eyes half closed and perfectly still. Chapter 2. The Machinery of Respectability. We departed for Surrey on the 8:15 from Waterloo. Holmes carrying nothing but a small leather case and the morning's edition of the Times, which he read with the rapid, purposeful attention of a man extracting intelligence rather than seeking entertainment. I had slept poorly, my mind turning over Ainsworth's account in the restless way that a difficult case always provoked in me during those early hours before the facts had settled into any useful arrangement. Holmes, by contrast, appeared entirely composed, gazing out at the suburban rooftops as they gave way to November fields with an expression of mild, almost botanical interest. You are thinking about Judge Reed, said I, attempting one of those exercises in observation which his company had, over the years, occasionally inspired. He glanced at me with something between amusement and approval. What leads you there? Ainsworth mentioned him twice, with a particular care. The sort of care one uses around a name one considers beyond question. It struck me as slightly forced. It is a reasonable thread, said Holmes, returning to the window, though I confess my own thoughts are at present occupied with ink. I did not press him further. He would elaborate when it served the investigation, not before. The courthouse at Guildford was a handsome Georgian structure, set back from the high street behind a low stone wall and a row of plane trees that had surrendered their leaves to the autumn without apparent regret. It wore an air of settled permanence, the kind of building that discourages the imagination from associating it with anything hasty or irregular. I remarked as much to Holmes as we approached. Precisely, said he without breaking stride, which is, of course, greatest utility to someone who wished to commit a very careful crime. We had arranged, through Ainsworth, to speak with 3 individuals connected with the trial administration. The first was Judge Bartholomew Reed himself, received us in a small room adjoining the main court chamber. He was a tall man of 70 or thereabouts, white-haired and lean, the deeply scored features of someone who had spent decades delivering verdicts that other men found inconvenient. His manner was not unfriendly, but it carried the automatic authority of one who has not been seriously questioned in a very long time. He acknowledged the irregularities around the jury substitution, with what I can only describe as controlled impatience. Proper forms had been followed, he insisted. A physician's certificate had been submitted. The registrar had processed the substitution in the prescribed manner. If records were subsequently mislaid, that was a matter for the court administration, not for the bench. Holmes listened without interruption, his eyes moving not to the judge's face, but, I noticed, to his hands. Reed kept them flat upon the table throughout, perfectly still, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has taught himself not to fidget. "Your Honour has presided at these assizes for how many years?" Holmes asked pleasantly as we rose to leave. 23, said Reed. "A remarkable tenure. You must know every corner of this building." "Dare say I do," including, no doubt, the records room on the lower floor. Holmes smiled with perfect courtesy. "Good morning, Your Honour." Reed did not return the smile, and as we passed into the corridor I caught, in the thin line of his mouth, something that was not quite irritation and not quite fear, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. The court registrar, Felix Pomeroy, met us in his own office, a tidy, rather airless room lined with shelves of bound volumes. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 40, a fair complexion, and the groomed, slightly watchful quality of a man who has constructed his professional persona with some effort, and maintains it through constant small attentions. His handshake was firm, speech deliberate, and his Yorkshire vowels gave his conversation a blunt, northerly texture that sat oddly, now and then, against the formality of his phrasing. He was, on the surface, entirely cooperative. The substitution of Thomas Vale had been routine. He explained. The physician's certificate, signed by a Dr. Hewson of Croydon, had been received and logged. The replacement juror, Wren, had appeared punctually and conducted himself without incident. If the paperwork was now incomplete, he was at a loss to account for it, and he offered to assist in any reconstruction of the records that might be required. Holmes thanked him, examined 3 of the bound registers with unhurried attention, while Pomeroy watched, and asked whether he might retain 1 page of comparative ledger entries for further study. Pomeroy agreed with a readiness that suggested he had already calculated which documents could safely be surrendered. We called next upon Mrs. Agnes Vale, the wife of the juror who had fallen ill. She received us in the parlour of a modest house on the edge of the town, a small, composed woman in her late 40s, whose grief, I sensed, had less to do with her husband's illness than with some longer-standing sorrow. Thomas Vale had recovered. She told us, which I had not previously known. He was at present staying with his sister in Dorset, still weak, and she had not wished to trouble him with questions about what she considered a bureaucratic muddle. "Has he spoken of the trial at all?" Holmes asked. "Only to say he was relieved not to have served," said Mrs. Vale. "He found the whole business upsetting, even from a distance." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, and said nothing further on the point, though I observed that he fixed the detail in his expression with that particular stillness that meant he considered it significant. Inspector Hatherley of the Surrey Constabulary joined us that afternoon at the local station, broad, energetic man, with an enthusiast's confidence in his own conclusions. He had formed his theory early, and saw no compelling reason to revise it. Sir Edwin Mallory was a man of flexible morals and considerable resources. The juror substitution, in Hatherley's view, was straightforwardly a matter of blackmail or bribery. The original juror removed, compliant replacement inserted, the desired verdict obtained. The absence of direct evidence troubled him less than it perhaps should have done. "These wealthy men," said he, spreading his hands, "know how to keep their arrangements clean. That's what their solicitors are for." "Vanishing of Wren," said Holmes. "Paid off and departed. Somewhere warm, I shouldn't wonder." Holmes received this with a polite inclination of the head, and did not argue. As we walked back to the inn where we had engaged rooms for the night, however, he paused beneath one of the plane trees, and drew from his case the ledger page he had taken from Pomeroy's office, holding it at an angle to catch the last of the fading afternoon light. "The ink," said he at last, with quiet satisfaction. I looked over his shoulder at the page. To my eye it was a perfectly ordinary administrative entry. Names, dates, reference numbers, written in a neat, consistent hand. "I see nothing remarkable," I admitted. "You would not without knowing what to seek." He pointed to the dried surface of the ink, which in the low light showed a very faint blue-black undertone. "This is not commercial ink, Watson. This particular formulation has been used exclusively by 3 government offices in London for the past 11 years. I have made a study of inks. The topic is less tedious than it sounds, and considerably more useful. No county courthouse would hold a supply of it. Someone carried it here from London, deliberately, and used it to write an entry that was intended to appear local and routine." He folded the page and replaced it with care. "The amendment to the jury roll," I said slowly, "not made by anyone inside this courthouse at all." "It was made by someone who passed through this courthouse," Holmes replied, "and who brought with them the tools of a rather different trade." We walked on through the early dark, gas lamps of the High Street coming up, one by one ahead of us, and I found myself reconsidering every composed and credible face we had encountered that day, wondering which of them concealed behind its practised surface the knowledge of what had been done. Chapter 3. Juror Who Never Existed. We returned to London the following morning, and Holmes spent the better part of the journey in a silence so complete that I gave up attempting conversation after the second tunnel, and occupied myself with a medical journal I had brought along for precisely such an eventuality. It was only as the train drew into Waterloo, and the most great wall of the city closed around us, that he spoke, and then only to say that he intended to spend the afternoon in Croydon, and that I was welcome to accompany him if I found my schedule permitted it. I found that it did. The street in Croydon where Caleb Wren had kept his tobacconist's shop was a narrow, respectable-looking row of small commercial premises, set between a draper's and a bootmaker, whose sign wanted repainting. The shop itself still bore faded gilt lettering above the door, the legend Wren and Co. Tobacconists, though the window was dark, and a card in the lower pane announced, in a hand that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and final, that the premises were closed until further notice. Holmes had obtained a key, through means he did not specify, and we entered without difficulty. The interior was small, and smelled of cold air and the ghost of tobacco, a pleasant, faintly woody residue that lingered in the shelves and the bare wooden counter, as though reluctant to acknowledge the shop's abandonment. The stock had been removed with some thoroughness. The glass cases emptied, the drawers cleared, the small brass scales on the counter stripped of their weights. Yet it was not the absence of things that interested Holmes. He moved through the room with the unhurried, systematic attention of a naturalist examining a habitat, touching nothing at first, simply looking. I watched him crouched beside the cold fireplace and examined the grate. He produced his lens, studied the interior for a moment, then reached in and withdrew a small blackened fragment of paper, curved and brittle as a dead leaf. "Correspondence," said he, holding it to the light from the window. "Burned recently, within the last 2 weeks, I should say. The weather has been cold enough to preserve the ash longer than usual." Whoever cleared this shop was methodical, but they were also in something of a hurry at the end. He set the fragment carefully on the counter and continued his examination. The shelves yielded little. A few empty paper bags printed with the shop's name, a broken pen nib, and a small blue envelope, empty, kind used for personal rather than commercial correspondence. Holmes held this last item at arm's length and studied its inner surface. "Quality paper," said he. "Better than anything a Croydon tobacconist would ordinarily receive." In the small back room, which had served apparently as both storeroom and private quarters, the situation was more revealing. A deal table, a narrow iron bed frame, without its mattress, a wardrobe standing open and bare. But on the wardrobe's upper shelf, pushed to the very back, and apparently overlooked in the haste of departure, lay a folded piece of cloth. Holmes drew it out and spread it on the table. It was the lining, cut cleanly from the inside of a coat. Sewn into one corner was a small woven label of the sort that better tailors attached to their work. The label itself had been partially removed, not entirely. A single thread still held a fragment bearing the letters Ron, and below them in smaller type. "Don St. a London tailor," I said. "Somewhere on a street ending in Don Street, perhaps." "Grosvenor Street? Welbeck? Brandon?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He was examining the cloth itself, rubbing it between his fingers with a concentrated, almost respectful attention. "The cut," said he at last, "is military in its proportions. A long back vent, narrow sleeves, high collar, prut. Whoever wore this coat was not accustomed to the loose comfort of civilian dress. He had been wearing a uniform of some kind for long enough that it had shaped his expectations of how clothing should fit." He folded the lining and placed it in his case. Then he returned to the grate and, with considerable delicacy, extracted 2 further fragments of burned correspondence. I peered over his shoulder at the larger of the 2. Most of it was illegible, consumed to ash, but near one edge a few words had survived, scorched brown at their margins. The letters R, followed by a space, then the word Thursday. And below that, in different handwriting, the single word agreed. 2 writers, I observed. Precisely. An instruction and a confirmation. Simple enough to be deniable. Specific enough to be useful. Holmes straightened and looked about the bare room, with an expression I had learned to associate not with satisfaction, but with the recognition that a question had sharpened itself into a more useful form. "What do we have, Watson? Man who presented himself to the world as a modest tradesman, but who carried correspondence on good quality paper, wore a London tailored coat, cut to military specification, and who, the moment his single purpose was accomplished, vanished as efficiently as if he had never existed." The neighbours described him as formal in his speech, I recalled. "Courteous, but stiff." "Stiff," Holmes repeated with emphasis. "Not shy, not awkward. Stiff, as a man is stiff when he is performing a role he has learned, rather than living one he has grown into. There is a difference. Ordinary people feel it without being able to name it." He picked up his case. "I should like very much to speak to those neighbours." We spent the next hour moving along the street, calling at the drapers, the bootmakers, 3 private residences whose occupants had clearly observed the tobacconist's shop, with the quiet diligence that characterises close-quartered living. The portrait that emerged was consistent. Wren had kept the shop for approximately 6 months, had been pleasant without being friendly, kept irregular hours, and had not, so far as any neighbour could determine, socialised with anyone in the street or the surrounding district. One detail offered by the draper's wife with the innocent confidence of someone who does not know she is providing evidence, arrested Holmes's attention entirely. "He was very neat about himself," said she, comfortable woman of 50, who had evidently watched the comings and goings of the street with proprietary interest. "Very correct. When he took his hat off, he did it just so every time, even if he was only stepping inside his own door. My husband said it put him in mind of a soldier." Holmes thanked her with a warmth that I recognised as genuine rather than professional, and we walked back toward the high street in the thin November sunshine. "A soldier, or someone trained in an equivalent discipline," said Holmes. "The hat removed with identical precision regardless of audience. That is not manners, Watson. Manners are social. That is drill, physical habit, so thoroughly internalized that it operates independently of conscious decision." I turned this over as we walked. Then he was not merely a man who had fallen into debt and accepted a criminal commission out of desperation, I said. He was someone with genuine professional training, playing a part he had been specifically selected to play. "Selected," said Holmes, "and prepared. The shop existed. For 6 months, long enough to establish a credible local presence, short enough to avoid the accumulation of the sort of documentary record that time inevitably creates. Tax assessments, guild registrations, the small bureaucratic sediment of an actual life. None of it exists. I have already made inquiries." "No birth certificate either," I said, recalling what Ainsworth had mentioned. "No birth certificate, no apprenticeship record, no prior address that leads anywhere other than a blank wall." Holmes's voice had taken on the particular quality it assumed when the dimensions of a problem had grown larger than its first appearance suggested. "Caleb Wren is not a man who concealed his past. He is a man who was manufactured for a single occasion and then unmade. Question is not who wore that identity, Watson. The question is who built it." He said nothing further until we had hailed a cab and were moving back toward the river. Then, almost conversationally, though the thought had only just occurred to him, "I wonder how many others there are." I asked him what he meant. He looked out at the passing streets with an expression I can only describe as sober. "Manufactured citizens," said he quietly. "Men who exist in no register, but the one in which they were placed deliberately. It would not be a difficult enterprise, given the right position and sufficient patience. It would merely require someone who understood, in the most practical terms, exactly how trust in official records is maintained, and where, therefore, its vulnerabilities lie." The cab rattled on through the grey afternoon, and I sat with that thought, in a silence that for once Holmes made no attempt to fill. Chapter 4. The Clerk with the Northern Accent. Host. Holmes. Holmes spent the 2 days following our return from Croydon in a manner that would have alarmed anyone unfamiliar with his methods. He received no visitors, sent no telegrams that I was aware of, and occupied himself, apparently, with nothing more purposeful than sitting in his armchair reading, or standing at the window, watching the street below, with an abstracted expression that suggested his attention was directed considerably further than Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson brought meals which went largely untouched. I made no comment. I had learned, across many years and many cases, that this apparent stillness was, in fact, the most active phase of Holmes's working process, the interval in which impressions were sorted, contradictions examined, and the shape of a problem allowed to declare itself without the interference, premature conclusion. On the morning of the 3rd day he emerged from his room at 7:30, dressed for travel, and announced over breakfast that we were going to Surrey again. and that this time our business was principally with Felix Pomeroy. Found something, I said. I have found the outline of something, he replied, which was, for Holmes, significant concession to uncertainty. We arrived at Guildford before noon, and made our way directly to the courthouse, where Holmes had arranged through Ainsworth to conduct what was described to Pomeroy as a routine follow-up inquiry. The registrar received us in his office with the same composed cooperation he had displayed during our first visit, though I thought I detected, beneath the surface of his welcome, a quality of watchfulness that had not been so apparent before. He had had time to think since we last met. Thinking had made him careful. Holmes settled into the chair across from Pomeroy's desk, and opened the conversation with the inconsequential ease a man paying a social call. "I am grateful for your patience with this business," said he. "I imagine it has been rather tiresome, having one's office subjected to repeated scrutiny on account of what amounts, in the end, to a clerical irregularity." Pomeroy received this with a small, measured smile. "The administration of justice depends upon accuracy," said he. "I am as concerned as anyone to understand how the irregularity arose." Just so. Holmes glanced about the room with apparent idleness, his eyes moving across the shelves of registers with the unhurried ease of a man who has seen nothing particularly interesting and expects to continue seeing nothing particularly interesting. "You have been registrar here for how long, Mr. Pomeroy?" 7 years this coming spring. Before that, I held a similar position in the West Riding, Harrogate, principally tough. Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already known and found entirely unremarkable. Then he said, in exactly the same conversational tone, "I noticed during our previous visit that your personal correspondence, the letter you were in the act of folding when we entered, was addressed in a rather different hand from the one you use in your official registers. Most people's handwriting is fairly consistent across contexts, allowances made for formality or haste. In style, the letter forms themselves are distinct. It is as though two different people have been at work. The silence that followed was brief, but it was not comfortable. I have never had a particularly consistent hand," said Pomeroy after a moment. "Tutors at school despaired of me." "No doubt," said Holmes pleasantly. "Tell me, do you recall which physician certified Thomas Vale's illness? The name on the certificate, I mean." The change of subject appeared to relieve Pomeroy somewhat, which was, I suspected, precisely the effect Holmes had intended. "A Dr. Hewson," said he, "of Croydon, I believe. The certificate was properly formatted and carried the appropriate registration details." "Quite so. And it arrived how? By post or delivered by hand?" Pomeroy paused, and I watched him make a small decision. "By post," said he. Holmes rose, thanked him, moved toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back, as if struck by an afterthought of no great importance. "One further thing. Your cuffs, if you will forgive an impertinent observation, are of excellent linen. The tailoring of your coat is equally fine. London work, I think, fairly recent. A Harrogate salary, even a senior one, would not ordinarily run to such things." Pomeroy's expression did not change, but his hands, which had been resting on the desk, moved into his lap. "I have modest savings," said he. "Of course," said Holmes, wished him good afternoon. We walked in silence along the corridor and out through the heavy courthouse doors into the pale winter light. Holmes's step had a suppressed energy to it that I recognized. "He is frightened," I said, once we were clear of the building. "Thoroughly," said Holmes, "and has been for some time. Fear of that particular vintage has a way of reshaping a man's face. Watson, if you know where to look, it settles most visibly around the eyes and the jaw. Not in moments of direct challenge, but in the instants of apparent relief, when the immediate threat has passed and the underlying dread reasserts itself. He paused at the gate, drawing on his gloves. The handwriting is the crucial point. I have compared the amendments to the jury roll with Pomeroy's official entries. Two are consistent with one another. There is no serious question of that, but when I examined the letter on his desk, which he was too slow to conceal entirely, the hand was quite different. Smaller, more compressed, the characteristic irregularities of someone who learned to write in an institutional rather than a domestic setting. Government school, perhaps, or a workhouse, somewhere that valued legibility over individuality. I considered this. So the polished Pomeroy is, to some degree, a construction source. The handwriting suggests a man who has spent years perfecting one style for public use, while the original persists, surfacing in unguarded moments. Holmes looked back at the courthouse with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite contempt. He processes official substitutions, Watson. He knows which documents must be filed, where, which signatures will be examined and which will not, how long a certificate must age, before it becomes simply part of the record. He is, in short, precisely the sort of man a sophisticated forger would find indispensable. But not the forger himself. Decidedly not. The man I am looking for possesses confidence as well as skill. Pomeroy has skill in abundance, but confidence has been frightened out of him. We were making our way back toward the inn to collect our bags, when a messenger found us, boy of 14 or so, who thrust an envelope at Holmes with the breathless importance of someone who has been told his errand is urgent. Holmes read the note inside, then handed it to me. It was from Ainsworth, written in haste and without his usual legal precision. Mrs. Agnes Vale had that morning presented herself at his office with a bundle of letters, which she declared had been sent to her husband in the weeks preceding the trial. The letters were threatening in character. They implied, she said, that Thomas Vale would suffer professional and personal consequences if he sat upon the jury in the Mallorer case. She had withheld them initially out of distress, but her conscience had overcome her reluctance. I looked up from the note. Holmes's face wore an expression I had not seen there before in connection with this case. Not excitement, not the focused intensity of a man approaching his quarry, but something more cautious. A reserve. "This troubles you," I said. "It interests me enormously," said Holmes, beginning to walk again. "But not for the reasons it is intended to. You think the letters are staged." He tucked his gloves under his arm and turned up his collar against the cold. Watson is seldom literary. A man who believes himself truly threatened does not compose letters for the occasion. He acts, or he does not act, but he does not write. These letters appear at precisely the moment when Inspector Hatherley requires a human villain to pursue. They point that pursuit firmly towards Sir Edwin Mallory. He paused. "It is extremely convenient. In my experience, extreme convenience of that particular kind deserves the most uncomfortable scrutiny." We boarded the afternoon train with the threatening letters in Holmes's case, fog, beginning to thicken along the river valleys below us as the light failed, and I found myself thinking about a man sitting in a back room somewhere, constructing not merely documents, but the very sequence of events by which those documents would be discovered. It was, I reflected, deeply unsettling form of intelligence. Chapter 5. The Actor Behind the Counter. Holmes devoted the following morning to the threatening letters, spreading them across the sitting room table with the methodical care of a curator arranging a delicate exhibition. I had examined them myself the previous evening and found them persuasive. 3 notes written in a cramped and agitated hand on plain paper, each warning Thomas Vale, in terms of escalating severity, that his participation in the Mallory jury would bring consequences he would not welcome. They were undated, unsigned, and carried no postmarks, having apparently been delivered by hand. For all their apparent urgency, Holmes handled them with a detachment that I found instructive. "The paper," said he, holding the second letter to the window, "is cheap, but uniformly so. 3 letters from an agitated correspondent over several weeks would ordinarily show variation. Different batches, different conditions of storage. Perhaps a sheet torn from a different pad in a moment of impatience. These 3 are identical in weight, texture, age. They were written at approximately the same time, and on paper drawn from the same source. Manufactured together, I said, composed as a collection rather than sent as a sequence." He set the letter down. "And the handwriting, though convincingly irregular in its anxiety, repeats itself in one particular. The letter G, which drops its tail in a consistent manner that no genuinely distressed person would sustain across 3 separate compositions. Distress interrupts habit. These letters were written carefully, Watson, by someone imitating distress from the outside. Chord of He said nothing further about the letters that morning, filing them in his case with a neat finality that suggested they had told him what he needed to know and would not be consulted again until the proper moment. By mid-afternoon we were in the Strand, making a call that Holmes had prepared for, with an hour spent in consultation with a directory of theatrical agencies that he kept, along with several other improbable reference volumes, on the lower shelf of his bookcase. The agency we visited occupied 3 rooms above a printer's shop, a reception area tended by a young woman of efficient bearing, 2 inner offices from which emerged, periodically, the sound of argument conducted at considerable volume. The proprietor, a Mr. Sidney Vane, received us with the practised cordiality of a man whose livelihood depends upon making strangers feel they have arrived at precisely the right place. He was round, quick-eyed, and dressed with a theatrical extravagance that stopped just short of absurdity. A waistcoat of embroidered silk, watch chain of unusual weight, and a carnation in his buttonhole that had seen better days, but had not yet been persuaded to acknowledge it. Holmes placed before him a description of Nathaniel Crowe, derived from inquiries he had evidently made before I was aware the name existed, and asked whether Vane had had dealings with such a man. Vane's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Nat Crowe," said he, after a pause that was a fraction too considered. "Yes, I knew him. Minor work, mostly, dialectic pieces, character parts, the sort of roles where you need someone who can become thoroughly unremarkable. He had a gift for that. Funnily enough, very useful on stage when you need the audience to forget someone is there." "When did you last see him?" Holmes asked. 7 months ago. He came in looking for work, as they do. I had nothing suitable, and told him so. He seemed, if I am honest, not entirely displeased." Vane smoothed his remarkable waistcoat with one hand, as if work was not quite the point of the visit. Holmes received this with the stillness of a man who has just heard something confirm a thought. He has been carrying patiently for some time. Before that visit, had his habits or circumstances changed in any way that you observed? Vane considered. "He had money," said he at last, with the candid simplicity of a man who regards money as the primary organizing principle of human behaviour. Not ostentatiously, but comfortably. He had been in rather pinched circumstances the previous year. The sort that make a man take any part that's offered, however undignified. Then, rather abruptly, the pinch appeared to ease. He dressed better, moved to a nicer set of lodgings in Bloomsbury, and became, shall we say, selective about what he would consider. Did he mention how his circumstances had improved? He said he had secured a private engagement. Coaching, he implied. Helping someone with an accent or a manner of presentation. It is not uncommon in our profession. The wealthy sometimes wish to sound like something other than what they are, and occasionally the reverse. Vane permitted himself a small, worldly smile. I asked no further questions. In this trade, Mr. Holmes, one learns the value of selective incuriosity. We obtained Crow's last known address from the agency's records, a service Holmes secured through a combination of evident authority and what I suspect was a discreet financial incentive administered at the reception desk. Spent the remainder of the afternoon tracing his movements through Bloomsbury. The lodgings in question were in a quiet street near the museum, a house of decent character where a landlady of advanced years and considerable observational capacity had a great deal to say. Once Holmes had engaged her willingness with the particular quality of respectful attention he deployed when he needed information from someone accustomed to being talked at rather than listened to. Crow had lodged with her for 4 months, she said. He had been a considerate tenant, quiet and regular in his habits, though she had noted he received one visitor with some frequency. A gentleman, she was quite certain of that, well-dressed and soft-spoken, who never gave a name and who invariably called after dark, departing within an hour. "Did you ever hear what passed between them?" Holmes asked. She bridled slightly, then capitulated to honesty. "Voices only. Through the floor, you understand." The gentleman's voice was educated, very controlled, the sort that doesn't carry accidentally. Mr. Crow's, I heard more clearly. He seemed to be repeating things. Phrases. Names, possibly. As if he were learning something by heart. Holmes thanked her with genuine warmth, and we stepped back into the street. "Rehearsal," I said. "Precisely." The visitor coached him in the identity he was to inhabit. Names, addresses, the small biographical details that make a man credible under casual inquiry. Holmes turned his collar up against the evening air, and the visitor was careful enough to call, after dark, and to keep his voice below the threshold of accidental disclosure. "That is not a man improvising a deception, Watson. That is a man who has managed deceptions before, and knows exactly where they tend to fail. Crow was a pawn, as you said, an expensive and talented one, but a pawn, nonetheless." We walked in silence for a moment. "What interests me more than Crow himself is the nature of the engagement." The visitor did not hire an ordinary confederate. He sought out a professional whose particular skill was the inhabitation of unremarkable characters. Someone who understood that the most durable disguise is not a costume, but a manner. A set of small, habitual physical behaviours so consistent that they pass beneath the threshold of conscious observation. The removal of a hat, for instance. He said it lightly, as a man might mention a detail already established and needing no elaboration. But I heard in it the closing of a circuit, connection of the military precision observed by the draper's wife in Croydon to the deliberate, professional coaching administered in these Bloomsbury rooms. We turned back toward Baker Street, as the street lamps came up, and Holmes stopped once, briefly, before the dark window of a printer's shop to examine his own reflection with an expression of private amusement that I did not entirely understand. "The abandoned tobacconist's shop," I said, remembering the detail I had been meaning to raise since Croydon. "You found traces of theatrical grease paint in the back room. I have been thinking about that. Have you?" He walked on. "And what have you concluded?" That crow did not merely live as Caleb Wren. He prepared for it there, physically, as an actor prepares backstage. The shop was not simply his cover address. It was his dressing room. Holmes glanced at me with an expression that, in a less disciplined man, been called delight. "You continue to improve," said he, and appeared to mean it entirely. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread his notes across the table and stood over them for a long moment before writing a single name on a fresh sheet of paper, underlining it once with a firm, deliberate stroke. But when I passed his desk on my way to bed, caught the name in the lamplight, written in his precise angular hand. It was not Crow. It was not Pomeroy. It was a name I did not yet recognize, Port, and I lay awake longer than I might have wished, listening to the quiet sounds of the street below and wondering what thread Holmes had followed to a place I had not yet managed to reach. Chapter 6. The Name Beneath the Name. Holmes did not explain the name on the paper that night, or the following morning, and I had sufficient experience of his working methods to understand that asking would produce nothing useful. He was at his desk before I came down to breakfast, surrounded by what appeared to be census extracts, municipal rate books, and several pages of his own dense, cramped notation. A telegram arrived at 8:30, which he read, folded, placed in his inside pocket without remark. By 9 he had his coat on. "The Public Record Office," said he, "and then, if the morning goes as I expect, Somerset House. I may be some hours. Shall I come?" "Come." He considered this with apparent seriousness. "Not yet. I want you to call on Ainsworth. Ask him to obtain for you, through whatever channel he finds appropriate, a list of every jury substitution recorded at the Surrey Assizes over the past 4 years. Not merely the Mallory case, all of them. I must have shown some surprise at the scope of this, because he paused at the door with that expression he wore, when he judged that a small amount explanation would save a larger amount of subsequent confusion. "If a man has built a mechanism," said he, "one does not assume he constructed it for a single occasion." He was gone before I had finished my coffee. Ainsworth received my request that afternoon with the careful neutrality of a solicitor, who has learned to keep his reactions professionally contained, but I saw his pen slow slightly as he wrote the details in his notebook. He said he would do what he could, and that I might expect a response within 48 hours. As I rose to leave, he asked, with a studied casualness that did not entirely deceive me, whether Holmes was close to a conclusion. "He is close to a larger question," I said, which was the most accurate answer I could offer. Holmes returned to Baker Street at 6:30 that evening, set his hat and coat aside with unhurried deliberateness, and lowered himself into his armchair in the manner of a man who has been on his feet since early morning, and is prepared to concede the point to his legs, if not to his mind. I poured him a whisky and water without being asked, and waited. "4 names," said he at last, staring at the ceiling with his fingertips pressed together in that familiar steepled attitude. "Over a period of slightly more than 3 years, 4 separate individuals appear in the census rolls and municipal voter registrations. for the Greater London area, who share a set of characteristics find collectively remarkable. All 4 were entered into the records as residents of districts where the verification of new arrivals is, by the nature of the administrative process, largely nominal. All 4 possess documentation which is complete on the surface: birth certificates, prior addresses, trade registrations, but which, on examination, leads within 2 steps to a dead end. Certificate references a parish register, from which no corresponding original entry can be retrieved. An address proves to be a rooming house, demolished 3 years before the date given. In each case, the paper is in order, and the paper is all there is. I set down my glass. 4 manufactured citizens. 4 that I have found, Holmes said with a precision that made the qualification more unsettling than a larger number would have been. The method is consistent enough to be recognizable and varied enough to have avoided detection by any single records office. Each set of documents was processed through a different administrative channel. The only common thread I followed from instance to instance, is a small idiosyncrasy in the way the registration numbers were assigned. A sequence preference, one might call it. A tendency to select numbers from a particular range within each batch, which would be meaningless to anyone not comparing multiple examples side by side. It is the signature of a single practitioner working across different systems, and all of them traceable to Pomeroy. Holmes turned his head to look at me directly. 3 of the 4 pass at some point in their documentary chain through amendments or certifications bearing Pomeroy's hand. The 4th does not, was processed through a records office where Pomeroy served as a temporary advisor during a period of administrative reorganization. 18 months ago, he paused. He is the instrument, Watson, but instruments do not select their own targets. Someone directs where and when and for what purpose. The following morning brought the clarification I had not anticipated, and it arrived not through Holmes's methodical excavation of records, but through a moment of pure, ungoverned accident of the kind that occasionally intrudes upon the most carefully reasoned investigation. We had returned to Guildford at Holmes's request. He wished to examine the courthouse archives one further time and had arranged access through Ainsworth. We arrived early before the building had fully stirred to its daily routine. It was in the entrance corridor, still dim and cool at that hour, that we encountered Pomeroy, crossed. He was crossing from one passage to another with the brisk, contained purpose of a man attending to the first duties of the morning, and might have passed us with nothing more than a nod, had we not been accompanied by the courthouse's elderly porter, man named Gibbs, who had evidently known Pomeroy since the registrar's arrival in Guildford 7 years before. Gibbs greeted him with the comfortable familiarity of long institutional acquaintance, and in doing so used a name. Not Pomeroy. I heard it clearly because the corridor was quiet, and Gibbs spoke with the easy volume of a man slightly hard of hearing. A habitual slip, apparently, the kind that survives years of correction, because it is rooted in the period before the correction was learned. He caught himself at once, briefly mortified, and corrected to Pomeroy. But the other name had been said, and Holmes had heard it. Pomeroy walked on, without breaking his stride, which was itself, I reflected, an act requiring considerable self-possession. Holmes said nothing until we reached the archive room, and the door was closed behind us. Coast. Then he stood quite still for a moment, with an expression of quiet, settled certainty, like a man who has been searching for a particular volume and has finally found it shelved exactly where he should have looked first. "Frederick Pike," said he. I waited. I had the name last night, arrived at through the sequence irregularities in the registration numbers, which I traced to a disciplinary file. The disciplinary file at the General Register Office dating from 11 years ago. Clerk, named Frederick Pike, was dismissed for manipulating records in a manner insufficiently serious to warrant prosecution, but serious enough to end his government career conclusively. Holmes moved to the archive shelf and drew out a bound ledger with the ease of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for. Pike was methodical, imaginative, and apparently without the temperament for legitimate employment. He disappeared from official records, as such men sometimes do, and re-emerged, I now understand, as Felix Pomeroy. A new name, a new history, new credentials, all assembled with the very skills that had cost him his original position. He created himself, I said, the same way he created Caleb Wren, with rather more care and considerably more time. Holmes set the ledger on the table and opened it. Man who can build a false citizen from nothing is, after all, best qualified to build a false version of himself. The irony has a certain elegance. He is still not the principal, I said. You said so yourself. Someone directs him. Someone has directed him, Holmes agreed, and his voice had taken on a careful, deliberate quality that I had come to associate with those moments, with the moments when he was approaching territory he found not merely intellectually interesting, but genuinely troubling, and that someone required Pomeroy, or Pike rather, to have access to these specific archives. In this specific courthouse, at this specific level of institutional authority, he looked up from the ledger, which raises the question of who ensured that Frederick Pike, dismissed government clerk, with a fabricated identity, obtained a senior registrar's appointment in the Surrey Assizes and held it, challenge, for 7 years. The courthouse was beginning its day, measured sounds of an institution conducting itself with the confidence of unchallenged respectability. Someone vouched for him, I said slowly, someone of sufficient standing that his word required no verification. Holmes closed the ledger. We have been examining the mechanism, Watson. It is time to examine the hand that built it. He did not say the name then, but I saw, in the set of his expression, that he already knew it, and that knowing it had not brought him any particular satisfaction. Chapter 7. The Convenient Confession. The news arrived on a Thursday, announced by Inspector Hatherley in a telegram, whose tone of barely suppressed triumph required no particular skill in reading human nature to interpret. Nathaniel Crowe had been located in Liverpool, in lodgings near the docks, and had been taken into custody without resistance. More remarkably still, he had, within hours of his arrest, and without apparent coercion, offered a full confession. Hatherley invited Holmes to attend the formal proceedings in an official capacity, a gesture which, I suspected, rather more to the inspector's desire for an audience than to any genuine collaborative instinct. Holmes read the telegram twice, set it on the mantelpiece, and went to stand at the window. He remained there for an interval that I have since estimated at approximately 4 minutes, which is, in Holmes's economy of visible reaction, a considerable length of time. You are not pleased, I said. I am interested, he replied, without turning. Pleased would be premature. We travelled to Liverpool the following morning. Crowe was held at the Central Police Office, a solid smoke-darkened building, near the waterfront, where the smell of the river asserted itself even through closed windows. Hatherley received us in the corridor outside the interview room with an energy that the circumstances of a successful arrest produce in a naturally vigorous man. Crow had been cooperative from the first moment, he told us, had identified himself voluntarily, had waived any right to a solicitor, with what Hatherley described as a refreshing absence of the usual prevarication, and had provided a detailed account of his engagement by agents acting on behalf of Sir Edwin Mallory. "He names Mallory directly?" Holmes asked, without hesitation. "Says he was approached through an intermediary, paid in 2 instalments, provided with a complete set of instructions for how to present himself, and told that the jury room conversation was to be guided toward a finding of insufficient evidence. Hatherley's satisfaction was the particular kind that settles into a man's features when he believes the work is done. It fits precisely, Mr. Holmes. The substitution of the juror, the coached presentation, the vanishing afterward. Crow's account explains every element." "Does it?" said Holmes, and his voice was so perfectly level that only someone who had spent years listening to it would have detected the reservation it contained. Crow himself proved to be a thin, pale man of about 40, with the slightly unfinished look of someone whose natural expression had been professionally subordinated to so many adopted ones that the original had grown difficult to locate. He sat at the interview table, with his hands folded before him, and answered questions with a fluency that might, in another context, passed for simple honesty. Holmes listened through Hatherley's initial questions, and then, at an appropriate pause, permission to put several of his own. Hatherley acquiesced with generous magnanimity. "You have described," said Holmes to Crow, with an air of straightforward inquiry, "the arrangements of the courtroom during your service as a juror, host. You mentioned that the jury benches faced the dock at an angle of roughly 45 degrees, the judge's bench elevated to the left of the witness box." Crow nodded. "That is correct. And the arrangement of the other jurors placed Mr. Albright, the foreman, to your immediate right, with a Mrs. Farrow seated beyond him." "Yes," said Crow, without the smallest hesitation. Holmes thanked him pleasantly, asked 2 further questions of no apparent significance, indicated to Hatherley that he had finished. We stepped outside, while a constable attended to the remaining formalities. "Well," said Hatherley, when the door had closed behind us, "the courtroom at Guildford Assizes does not face the dock at the angle Crow described," said Holmes. "The configuration he gave would be consistent with 2 or 3 other courtrooms in the south of England, but not with that one. Man who had actually sat upon that jury for the duration of the Mallory trial, which ran to 11 days, could not misremember the basic geometry of the room in which he spent those 11 days." Hatherley's expression passed through several stages, none of them entirely comfortable. "A mistake, perhaps. Men misremember under the stress of arrest." "They misremember details," Holmes agreed. "They do not misremember the direction in which they sat and faced for nearly a fortnight. Furthermore, the jury foreman in the Mallory trial was not named Albright. I confirmed it from the court record before we left London. The foreman was a Mr. Colbeck, a retired draper from Reigate." The inspector's enthusiasm had acquired, by this point, a somewhat defensive quality. "You are saying the confession is false." "I am saying the confession was prepared by someone who did not have access to the precise details of the courtroom interior or the verified jury list. Someone who had the broad shape of events, but not the fine particulars." Holmes pulled on his gloves with characteristic neatness. "Crow is confessing to an arrangement of which he knows the outline, but not the substance. He was recruited, I have no doubt of that, but by someone who has taken great care to ensure that his confession, if he ever gave one, point in a single predetermined direction and no further. "Sir Edwin," I said. Conspicuously, exclusively, and conveniently, Sir Edwin. Holmes turned toward the stairs. "The man currently in that room is not protecting himself, Inspector. He is performing a service. Question is, for whom, and what has been promised to him in return?" Hatherley followed us down to the street with the slightly dazed expression. A man who has been presented with a solution he cannot immediately refute, and does not entirely wish to accept. Holmes left him at the door with a brief word of genuine encouragement, which I thought generous under the circumstances, and we walked in silence toward the waterfront. The sky over the Mersey was the colour of old pewter, and the wind off the water had a raw, purposeful quality that discouraged loitering. Holmes walked with his chin lowered and his hands in his pockets, posture he adopted. Quickly through material he had not yet arranged into speakable form. "Coached Crow's confession," I said. Knew enough of the case to construct a plausible account, but was working at one remove from the actual trial. They could not verify the courtroom details because they themselves were never in the courtroom, or they had access only to newspaper accounts. Holmes said, which were extensive and largely accurate in their broad outline, which naturally did not trouble themselves with the precise positioning of furniture. He paused at the edge of the quay, looking out at the grey water. "There is one further detail, Watson, which I have not yet mentioned. Fast. When I asked Crow to name the jurors he claimed to persuade during deliberations, he produced 3 names. One of those names belongs to a real member of the jury. The other 2 do not appear on the verified list at all. Whoever prepared his script had access to some genuine records, but not the complete roll. Partial access. Careful, selective. Partial access. The kind that a man might obtain through an intermediary rather than by examining the documents directly." He turned away from the water, which is consistent with someone who was managing this affair, who was managing from a sufficient distance to preserve his own insulation from it. Every layer of this construction, Crow, the coached confession, the theatrical letters, serves the same function, provides a surface for official attention to rest upon, comfortable and complete, seeming while the structure remains undisturbed. We had nearly reached the station when I recalled something that had been hovering at the edge of my attention since the interview room. "Pomeroy," I said. "Pike. We have heard nothing of him since Guildford." Holmes's expression did not change. Something in it sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Nor have I been able to locate him through any of my usual channels since yesterday morning." Walked on. "When a man of his particular utility vanishes at a moment of maximum inconvenience to any investigation, it is seldom because he has acted upon his own initiative. He has been removed from the board. One removes a piece that has become a liability, by the same hand that directed him. The same hand," Holmes confirmed, "that is now watching with considerable attention to see whether a false confession and a convenient disappearance are sufficient to close the matter to official satisfaction." The train north pulled out of Liverpool in the early evening, and I watched the city give way to the dark Lancashire fields with a sensation I have experienced perhaps 6 times in my years with Holmes, particular unease of a case that has grown, in the course of its investigation, into something larger and more troubling than it first appeared to be. We had begun with a tampered document and an absent juror. We had arrived, by careful degrees, at the edge of something that touched the foundations of institutional trusts itself. Holmes read for the first hour, then set his book aside and sat in stillness. For a long time his face turned toward the dark window, and I did not disturb him. Chapter 8. The Silent Benefactor. There are discoveries which arrive with a kind of intellectual violence, turning at a stroke the assumptions one has carried. Through a long investigation with the comfortable confidence of established fact, the revelation toward which Holmes had been working in the days following our return from Liverpool was not of that sudden kind. It came instead by gradual accumulation, each piece of evidence settling into place with the quiet inevitability of stones being laid rather than a structure being struck. And this measured quality made it, in some respects, harder to receive than a more abrupt disclosure would have been. Holmes spent the better part of 3 days in correspondence, sending and receiving telegrams, at an interval that kept Mrs. Hudson in a state of mild exasperation with the boy from the post office. He visited successive afternoons the offices of a charitable legal foundation in Gray's Inn, a private bank in the city, whose manager he appeared to know from some earlier professional connection, and the reading room of a club in Pall Mall, to which he did not belong, but whose librarian, it emerged, was willing to extend certain professional courtesies to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. On the third evening he returned to Baker Street later than usual, ate the supper. Mrs. Hudson had kept warm, with a thoroughness that told me the day had been physically as well as intellectually demanding, and then sat for an hour making notes, and then listened in the small, precise script he used when he wished to impose order on a body of material before presenting it. I waited, as I had learned to wait, without pressing. "The Ainsworth Foundation for Legal Education," said Holmes at last, setting his pen down, "was established 14 years ago for the stated purpose of supporting young men of limited means who wished to read law. It distributes modest annual grants, maintains a respectable if unexamined reputation in certain legal circles, conducts its financial affairs through a series of intermediary trustees, whose individual connection to the foundation is sufficiently remote as to be, in practical terms, invisible. A charitable institution," I said carefully. "One with charitable intentions, I have no doubt, at its inception." Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, resting one arm on the mantelpiece with the ease of a man about to explain something he has already fully understood. "Over the past 9 years, funds has been redirected through those trustees into a secondary set of payments, considerably less transparent, which my contact at the bank has been, with commendable professional discretion, able to trace in outline. The payments originate anonymously. They pass through at minimum 2 intermediate stages before reaching their destination, and they have, over the period in question, found their way to a small number of recipients whose connection to the legal system is not educational, but administrative." I set down my glass. "Pomeroy is among them. Frederick Pike, in his various identities, received payments from this chain on 4 separate occasions, each coinciding, within a window of several weeks, with the creation of a new false civic entry in the records I identified at Somerset House." Holmes looked into the fire for a moment. "Foundation is not the source of the money, Watson. It is a passage. Funds enter it from a private account, travel through the trustee structure, and emerge in a form that bears no visible connection to their origin." "And the private account?" Holmes turned from the fire and looked at me directly, with the particular steadiness he employed when delivering information he would have preferred, on personal grounds, not to be delivering at all. "The account is held in the name of a family trust," said he. "A trust established in the way that such things are established. to manage assets accumulated over a long professional lifetime. The trust bears the name of its founder, a man who has spent 23 years administering justice in the Surrey Assizes, whose reputation for personal integrity has been considered, by those who know him, to be beyond the reach of ordinary scrutiny. The name, when Holmes finally spoke it, was not a surprise. I had been moving toward it. I realized, since the corridor outside Judge Reed's chamber, since the careful flatness of his hands upon the desk, since the expression I had noticed, and then set aside as too improbable to pursue, and yet hearing it stated plainly in the familiar surroundings of Baker Street, with the fire burning low, and the sounds of the street coming up from below, produced a sensation I can only describe as the particular coldness that follows the confirmation of something one had hoped would prove to be wrong. "Reed," I said. "Bartholomew Reed." Holmes returned to his chair, 23 years upon the bench, record of judgments, widely cited for their rigour and their fairness. Letters after his name from 2 universities and a learned society. A man, in short, whose public character has been assembled with such completeness that the idea of examining what lay beneath it would have struck almost any observer as an impertinence. I thought of the thin, white-haired figure who had received us in the room adjoining the courthouse chamber, precise stillness of his hands, the controlled impatience of his manner, the way he had not returned Holmes's parting smile. How did Pike find him, I asked. A dismissed clerk and a senior judge, how does that connection form? Through the archives, Holmes said, which is, in retrospect, the only place it could have formed. Pike spent years in government records before his dismissal, and records offices accumulate material of a very wide description. Court documents, correspondence, administrative memoranda, the sediment of institutional life, deposited in layers, and rarely examined by anyone who was not specifically looking. He paused. 26 years ago, Bartholomew Reed was a rising barrister with a promising career, and a relative, a younger brother, conduct in a civil matter, had the potential to create considerable professional damage. A set of documents pertaining to that matter was altered before it reached the court. The alteration was subtle, competent and effective. Brother was protected. Reed's career continued its ascent. And Pike found the original documents, or found sufficient evidence of their alteration to understand what had been done. Holmes's voice was quite flat now, careful flatness of a man keeping the moral weight of a thing at a working distance. He did not move immediately. That is what distinguishes him from the ordinary blackmailer, Watson. He waited. He allowed Reed to rise further, to accumulate more to lose, to become so entirely identified with the public image of judicial rectitude that any challenge to it would be proportionally more devastating. Then, the position and the leverage were both at their maximum. He made himself known. And Reed could not refuse him. Perhaps, in the beginning, persuaded himself that what was asked was manageable. A character reference for a new position, a signature on an application. The kind of assistance that a man of standing provides routinely, which requires only the suppression of a question or two. Holmes turned his pen slowly in his fingers. Prude. It is the familiar mechanism of this particular form of coercion. Each concession is presented as the last, proves to be the foundation of the next. By the time Pike's operation had grown into something systematic, Reed was too deeply implicated to extract himself without destroying the very reputation his silence had been protecting. I sat for a time with this, feeling the particular weight of it. There was pleasure to be taken in the architecture of the thing, however elegant its construction, because what it described was the slow ruin of a man by a method that had all the efficiency of compounding interest and none of its neutrality. Tampered jury roll, I said at last. Mallory's acquittal. Reed must have known what was being done in his own courthouse. He knew and said nothing, and presided with his customary rigour over a trial whose outcome had been arranged before it commenced. Holmes set his pen down with a quietness that was, I thought, its own form of statement. He could not intervene without exposing himself. He could not refuse, without Pike making use of what he held. He had become, over many years of carefully chosen compromises, a man who was no longer capable of the honest act that would have been, at the beginning, merely uncomfortable. He rose, moved to the window, stood looking out at the darkened street below. "I have arranged," said he, without turning, "for certain materials to be placed before the appropriate persons tomorrow. Not Hatherley, above Hatherley." He paused. "Well, I want you to send a note to Ainsworth tonight, asking him to ensure that Judge Reed remains in Guildford for the next 48 hours. He need not know the reason. The request should be framed as a routine matter requiring Reed's administrative attention." I asked whether Holmes intended to confront Reed directly. He considered this for rather longer than the question, taken in isolation, seemed to require. "I intend," said he finally, "to give him the opportunity to make one honest decision before the matter is taken out of his hands, entirely. Whether he takes it is not within my power to arrange." He said nothing further that night, and I wrote the note to Ainsworth, and sat afterward by the dying fire, thinking about a man who had spent more than 2 decades dispensing justice, from an elevation constructed, at its base, upon a single act of concealment, and about what it costs, in the end, to maintain a height that cannot be honestly defended. Chapter 9. Holmes explains the impossible juror. The gathering took place at Baker Street on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, when the light fails before 4 o'clock, and the city draws itself inward against the cold. With a collective, unspoken resignation, Holmes had arranged it with a care for sequence that I recognised as deliberate. Not a confrontation, he had told me the previous evening, but a reconstruction, which was a distinction I was still turning over in my mind, as our visitors arrived by ones and twos through the afternoon. Inspector Hatherley came first, somewhat stiffly, having been informed only that the matter required his presence, and that certain developments had rendered the Liverpool confession insufficient as a basis for proceeding. He took the chair nearest the door with the unconscious instinct of a man who has not entirely decided whether he is attending as a colleague or a witness. Sir Edwin Mallory arrived shortly after, accompanied by his own solicitor, compact and watchful man, who said nothing and wrote nothing, but whose eyes moved continuously around the room with the assessing quality of someone calculating potential liabilities. Sir Edwin himself was more subdued than his public reputation had led me to anticipate. A broad, well-made man in his late 50s, whose natural confidence appeared, at present, to be operating under some internal constraint, like a large clock running slightly slow. Ainsworth I had met before at the door, and shown up myself. He settled into the corner of the sofa, with his hands folded, and an expression of composed attentiveness, professional mask of a man who has learned that the most useful thing a solicitor can do in a room full of unresolved facts is listen without visibly reacting. Judge Reed arrived last. He came alone, which struck me, and which I suspected struck Holmes, as the only brave decision the man had made in a very long time. He was dressed with his usual precise correctness, But something had changed in his bearing since our first meeting at the courthouse. The quality of controlled authority that had made him seem immovable then had thinned, as certain materials do, under sustained pressure, to reveal the more fragile structure it had always been concealing. He looked at Holmes as he entered, and at no one else. Holmes waited until everyone was settled, then stood before the fireplace without theatre and began to speak. He did not begin with Frederick Pike or with Judge Reed. He began, as I might have anticipated had I thought it through, with a pen nib. "The amendment to the jury roll," said he, addressing the room generally, in the level, precise tone he used, when he wished ideas to carry their own weight rather than his manner, was made using ink of a formulation exclusive to 3 government offices in London. This was not a clumsy error. It was an unavoidable one, because the man who made the amendment had spent his entire professional life working with that ink, and habits of material, like habits of mind, persist below the threshold of conscious attention. He paused. The amendment was made by Frederick Pike, formerly a records clerk in government service, who subsequently reinvented himself with considerable ingenuity as Felix Pomeroy, Registrar of the Surrey Assizes. He laid out the construction of Caleb Wren with the methodical clarity of a man dismantling a mechanism while explaining each component. The 6 months of preparation, the Bloomsbury rehearsals, the military precision of Nathaniel Crowe's trained performance, theatrical grease paint found in the abandoned shop, the coat lining that pointed to a London tailor of better standing than any modest tobacconist would ordinarily visit. He showed how the false citizen had been assembled not merely as a name in a register, but as a habitable identity, furnished with just enough observable detail to survive the casual scrutiny of neighbours and court officials, which dissolved entirely the moment anyone sought the documentary foundation that an actual life accumulates without effort or intention. Hatherley, I noticed, had taken out his notebook and was writing in it with the slightly chastened energy of a man revising a position he had publicly committed to. The threatening letters received by Thomas Vale, Holmes continued, were composed at approximately the same time, on paper from a single source, and contain a consistent stylistic idiosyncrasy in the formation of one letter that no genuinely distressed person could sustain across 3 separate compositions written over several weeks. They were designed to direct attention towards Sir Edwin Mallory, and to provide a narrative of impulsive, financially motivated corruption that would satisfy official inquiry and public appetite simultaneously. Nathaniel Crowe's coached confession served the same function. It named Sir Edwin, confirmed the bribery theory, contained just enough accurate detail to appear credible, while the errors it incorporated ensured that anyone examining it with sufficient care would find it hollow. Sir Edwin had gone quite still. His solicitor's pen was motionless above his pad. "I did not arrange this," Sir Edwin said, quiet directness that carried, I thought, the specific ring of a statement that a man has been rehearsing not for an audience, but for himself. I knew the verdict. I benefited from it. I did not know the means. "I am aware of that," said Holmes without particular warmth or reproach, "which is why you are present as an observer, and not as a subject of this explanation." He turned then to the financial structure. The foundation, trustees, the chain of payments that had funded Pike's operations over 9 years, each transaction timed to coincide with the creation of a false citizen in the civic record. He described how the network of manufacturer identities had served a dual purpose, securing individual verdicts for payment and testing the systematic patience of an engineer running trials. How deeply a fabricated person could be embedded in England's legal institutions before the fiction collapsed under its own weight. The most technically accomplished element of this enterprise, Holmes said, voice, and his voice had taken on the particular quality of genuine intellectual acknowledgement that he extended very rarely, was not the forgery itself. Skilled forger is not uncommon. It was the creation of an internal signature, a spacing irregularity in the registration numbers, consistent across every false entry. Invisible, unless one is comparing multiple examples simultaneously, and knows precisely what pattern to seek, was, in effect, a maker's mark, whether it was placed there deliberately, as a form of private authorship, or whether it represents an unconscious habit too deeply embedded to suppress. I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that it was the single thread that connected every manufactured identity to a single hand. He crossed to his desk and produced a sheet on which he had transcribed, in two parallel columns, a series of registration numbers from the false entries alongside the corresponding sequences from Pike's authenticated earlier government work. Even across the room the pattern was visible. A recurrence, an interval, preference that repeated like a fault line through otherwise varied material. Pike, Holmes explained, had not devised this operation alone. He had found, in the archived record of a long-buried civil matter, the lever that made the rest possible. A barrister's document, altered before it reached the court, a brother protected, a career preserved. The man who had benefited from that original concealment had been servicing its consequences at steadily increasing cost for the better part of a decade. Reed had not moved or spoken throughout. He sat with the stillness of a man who has decided, in advance of the moment, how he intends to meet it, and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. When Holmes said his name, Reed raised his eyes from the floor and looked at him with an expression that was not defiance and was not collapse, something quieter and less legible than either. "You were not," Holmes said carefully, "the architect of this fraud. You were its enabling condition. Without your position, your silence, and your institutional authority, Pike could not have placed himself where he needed to be. With them, he could operate for 9 years within the structure of the courts themselves, unexamined and unchallenged. Because the man best placed to challenge him had the most to lose by doing so, he set down the sheet of registration numbers. The original act, he continued, done in protection of a younger brother, and at a moment when you may have told yourself the harm was limited, and the necessity genuine. I do not propose to judge the act itself. I observe only that the cost of its concealment has exceeded, by a very considerable measure, anything the original decision could have been worth. The room was very quiet. The fire had burned down without anyone tending it, and the light from the windows had taken on the flat, greyish quality of mid-afternoon in December. Reed sat for a long moment, and then he did something I had not anticipated. He reached into his coat, produced an envelope, set it on the side table beside his chair. "I wrote that this morning," said he, "before I came here." Holmes glanced at it, but did not take it. "Your resignation," he said. "My full account," Reed replied. "Everything. From the beginning." He looked at Hatherley. "I imagine that will be of more use to you than anything I might say now." Hatherley took the envelope without speaking. Reed rose, because there was nothing further to be done. no charge yet formally laid, no authority yet exercised beyond the moral weight of the room itself. He walked to the door and let himself out. His footsteps descended the stairs with the measured steadiness of a man who has made a decision and intends to carry it to its end without theatrical assistance. Holmes remained at the fireplace until the street door closed below, and then sat down in his chair and said nothing for quite some time. The rest of us waited, and the winter light continued its slow withdrawal from the windows of Baker Street, and the case, in all its careful and troubling construction, effectively over. Chapter 10. The Correction of Names. The aftermath of a resolved case has its own particular texture, distinct from both the tension of the investigation and the satisfaction, where satisfaction exists, of its conclusion. In the weeks that followed the gathering at Baker Street, I watched the consequences of what Holmes had uncovered move through the legal and public world with the slow, irreversible force of water finding its level, and I found myself returning, more than once, to the thought that the resolution of a case and the resolution of its human damage are rarely the same event, nor do they arrive at the same time. Frederick Pike was located in Bristol 11 days after his disappearance from Guildford, living under a name that proved, upon examination, to be the fifth identity he had constructed for himself across a career of systematic reinvention. He was taken without incident, which surprised no one who had studied the pattern of his conduct. He was a man of calculation rather than impulse, and calculation told him, correctly, that resistance at that stage would purchase nothing. At his trial, which attracted rather less public attention than the Mallory affair had done, the full extent of his operation was laid before the court. 7 false civic identities created over a period of 11 years. 4 instances of jury manipulation, which the Mallory case was the most recent and the most elaborate. A network of payments channeled through charitable institutions with a patience and ingenuity that the prosecuting counsel described, with evident reluctant admiration, as remarkable. Pike was sentenced to 14 years, which Holmes received, when I read it to him from the newspaper, with a brief nod and no further comment. Nathaniel Crowe, who had confessed to a crime whose precise details he had been unable to accurately describe, was dealt with more leniently. His cooperation with the investigation following Pike's arrest, combined with the evident fact that he had been a recruited instrument rather than a designing intelligence, persuaded the court to a sentence of 18 months. He bore this, by all accounts, the philosophical equanimity of a man accustomed to inhabiting uncomfortable situations for finite periods and emerging from them more or less tact. The Mallory acquittal presented the law with a difficulty it was not entirely equipped to resolve. Sir Edwin had benefited from a fraud he had not commissioned, and of which, the evidence suggested, he had possessed no specific knowledge. His verdict could not, in strict legal terms, be disturbed. It stood, therefore, as an acquittal stands, final in its official character, and permanently ambiguous in its moral one. Sir Edwin retired from public commercial life within the month, which may have represented remorse, pragmatism, or simply the recognition that a reputation, once sufficiently complicated, ceases to be an asset worth the maintenance cost. I did not see him again after Baker Street, and Holmes never spoke of him except once, briefly, to observe that the men most damaged by the exposure of a conspiracy are sometimes those who had the least to do with constructing it. Judge Reed's resignation, and the account he had provided in the envelope. he left on the side table in our sitting room produced consequences that spread well beyond his own person. The account was thorough. It named names, described transactions, constructed, with a barrister's trained precision, the sequence of decisions by which a single act of concealment had become, 26 years, an architectural feature of his life. 3 further cases heard during Reed's tenure were subsequently reviewed, in 2 of which the administrative record showed evidence of Pike's interference at the jury selection stage. 1 conviction was upheld, 1 was referred for retrial. Reed himself faced no criminal prosecution, decision that caused some editorial discontent in the press, and which Holmes pressed on the point by a journalist who had evidently obtained his address from some improbable source, declined to comment upon beyond observing that the law's relationship with his own servants has always been a subject of considerable complexity. Reed's reputation, which had been the structure around which his entire adult life had been organised, did not survive the disclosure. He retired to the coast, to a small house near Eastbourne that had belonged to his family, and I have seen his name in print only once since, attached to a letter to a legal journal on a procedural question of no particular significance, written in a tone of such determined ordinariness that it read, "To my eye, as the communication of a man performing the act of continuing to exist." A host. Holmes had the newspaper editorials praising his resolution of the case delivered to Baker Street in the usual way, and disposed of them in the usual way also. I came down one morning to find 3 of them reduced to ash in the grate, the 4th deployed as an impromptu surface for a chemical experiment whose nature I chose not to investigate. He had moved on, or appeared to have moved on, with the characteristic rapidity that made it sometimes difficult to determine whether he experienced the conclusion of case as a satisfaction or merely as the removal of an occupation. I knew, however, that this one had settled in him differently, not because he said so, but because of a remark he made some weeks later, on an evening, when we had been sitting in companionable quiet on either side of the fire, and the subject had not, in any direct way, been raised. "Most corrosive property of institutional trust," said he, without preamble, "is that it operates most powerfully at precisely the point where it is most vulnerable. We extend confidence to a judge's ruling, registrar's record, a physician's certificate, not because we have verified these things ourselves, but because the system within which they exist has, over a long period, and in the aggregate, proved reliable. And it is that very reliability, that accumulated credit, which a sufficiently patient and intelligent man can draw upon without limit, provided he understands that the confidence is never in the document, but in the name attached to it. I considered this, and when the name proves false, then every document that bore it requires re-examination, and the re-examination reveals that most of them were entirely genuine, which is perhaps the most disquieting aspect of the whole affair. He turned his pipe in his hands without lighting it. Pike's operations succeeded for 11 years, not because he was forging things constantly, because he was forging things rarely, against a background of entirely legitimate work, which lent his forgeries the credibility they could not have generated alone. False entry was indistinguishable from the true ones surrounding because the man who made it was also responsible for the true ones. He was hiding counterfeits inside the genuine currency he himself was manufacturing. He fell silent and the fire settled in the grate, and the sounds of Baker Street continued their reliable commerce outside the window. "It disturbs you," I said. More than most cases, he did not deny it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. "A false man sat in judgment upon another man's fate," said he quietly, "not the actor, who was merely the surface of the thing. But the name itself, the name in the register, the name on the roll, the name that the court accepted and recorded and treated as the legal fact of a person's civic existence. That name was a construction built deliberately for a single occasion by someone who understood that the law does not see persons. See these names, and names, Watson, can be made. I have set down many of Holmes's cases across the years, and in most of them I find, upon reflection, something that satisfies the narrative instinct. A villain brought to account, a mystery resolving cleanly into its explanation, the disturbed order of things, restored to something resembling its proper arrangement. The affair of the Tampered jury roll offered most of these elements, and yet it declined to offer the sense of complete restoration that the tidier cases provide, because the thing it exposed was not a flaw that could be repaired by the imprisonment of the man who had exploited it, but a structural quality of the system itself. Trust, Holmes had said. Not the document, but the name, and names, as he had demonstrated with uncomfortable precision, were among the most malleable materials in human society. Thought about that for a long time after he said it, and I think about it still. Holmes returned to his chemical experiment the following morning, with every appearance of his customary energy. If the case remained with him in any persistent way, he chose not to demonstrate it. But I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he had taken down from his shelves a volume on administrative law that had not, to my knowledge, been consulted in the 8 years we had shared those rooms, and that it had been read with some thoroughness, if the density of his pencilled marginalia was any reliable indication. I did not ask him about it. There are questions whose answers one already has, in sufficient part, and which asking would only diminish. The winter deepened and Baker Street went about its business, and if the city's vast administrative machinery continued to operate with the serene self-confidence of a mechanism that has never been seriously examined, that was perhaps not remarkable. It is the nature of such things. Holmes knew it, and the knowledge sat in him, I thought, not as defeat, but as the particular alertness of a man who has understood, with complete clarity, the true dimensions of the work.